Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to Inago's exclusive session demonstrating live editing and review of a manuscript, revealing the level of scrutiny your manuscript will undergo from reviewers of top-tier journals. I am Deepesh Bodekar, your host and the moderator of today's session. Having worked in the editing and publishing industry for over 8 years, I have come across several manuscripts with critical quality issues and requiring major edits to be suitable for submission in high impact factor journals. Understanding the pain points of authors, we designed this session to help them understand the oversights caught by editors and reviewers and how we can help you with an in-depth developmental editing to enhance the manuscript quality and bridge any gaps. Feel free to send us your questions using the questions tab in the control panel on your screen or via the chat box. We will address them towards the end of the session. Before we begin, I would like to introduce you all to our expert editor, Dr. Emily Crow. Dr. Emily is the founder and lead translator of ETC Science Communication and is a highly experienced professional with over 10 years of expertise in copy editing, scientific content editing, proofreading, developmental editing, and reviewing. She holds a PhD in molecular biology from Northwestern University in Chicago. She has edited over 850 manuscripts for several high-profile publishers and service providers such as Nature Publishing Group and Macmillan Science Communication. Dr. Crow has overseen the peer review process for a portfolio of 6 biomed central biomedical journals, including BMC Cell Biology, BMC Molecular Biology, and BMC Pediatrics. With her exceptional skills and extensive experience, Dr. Emily Crow is an invaluable asset in helping authors achieve their publishing goals. A little bit about myself. I'm an experienced quality analyst and trainer and have worked in the editing and publishing industry for over 8 years. At Inago, I handle quality management and product development of various projects involving reputable global journals and publishers. Through my experience, I have developed a thorough understanding of journal submission requirements in diverse subject areas and how to help the English as a second language, that is, ESL authors, achieve successful publishing. I am very excited to host this session, and I thank you all for joining us today. Coming to the agenda of today's session, Emily will demonstrate manuscript editing and review, and while she does that, she will simultaneously discuss the following points. First, understanding the requirements of high impact factor journals through examples. The expert over here would elaborate on the factors which positively influence the publication in high impact factor journals. Exploring the substantial benefits of developmental editing. This will include tips on how the developmental editing enhances the scientific presentation of the findings. How to address limitations, fill literature gaps, refine methodology, or specify protocols. How each section of the manuscript can be drafted along with the to-dos of all researchers. Navigating additional support required for paper acceptance. That is, highlighting the importance of well-drafted cover letter and ensuring the plagiarized text is minimal in the manuscript. So without further ado, let me hand over the mic to Emily and start with the session.
Thank you for that introduction, Deepesh. You'll bear with me a moment. I'll go ahead and open up the file so that you can all follow along with me throughout this live edit. All right. So the paper that we are working on today is a paper that describes a study that has to do with the functional consequences of transcription in fission yeast under conditions of glucose starvation. We've taken a few extracts from this paper, as well as some extracts from the report that would accompany our edit to give you an idea of the kind of feedback and the kind of work that we do with your paper once it comes across our desk. As we move through the paper, you're going to see a variety of different colored edits that have been made to the text. So to give you an idea of what you're looking at, the blue text here are changes that have been made by the scientific editor, who's the first editor who sees your paper, and they primarily focus on the language usage, the English usage in the manuscript. The green edits and comments are made by myself as the quality assurance editor, and I focus a lot more on the global and overall effect of the paper, the content, structure, and the organization and the presentation. You will also see as we continue through the paper that there are passages that are highlighted in turquoise, and these are meant primarily to draw your attention to areas where we have added or rearranged text to help enhance the presentation of the manuscript. So we are going to start with the abstract. As you all know, this is one of, if not the most important parts of the paper. It's the first part of your paper that an editor or a reader will read. In some cases, it might be the only part of the paper that somebody reads, for instance, if they're searching on PubMed. So it's essential that this part of the paper is as complete and as precise as possible. So as an editor, what I'm looking for in an abstract and at any paper that I work with is to make sure that it includes elements of each part of the entire manuscript so that it gives a complete summary. So that means it needs to have background information from the introduction. It needs to provide a good summary of the methods, as well as a summary of all of the key findings from the study, and also concluding material, which is going to reflect what you say in the discussion. So let's work through this abstract together, and I can tell you what drew my attention and what my comments are and what changes that myself and the other editor have made. As you can see, these authors have done a fantastic job starting off the abstract with a description of the background information, talking about what glucose is, what transcriptional changes are, and why this is important specifically in fission yeast. They've then gone straight into explaining what the methodology is, talking about the direct RNA sequencing. And for me, I felt that there was information missing in between the background information and the methods, which is why I put a placeholder in here and a comment to the side where they've told us what is already known in the field. What they haven't told us is what we don't know and what the purpose of this experiment was, purpose of this study was. So I've inserted a comment here along with a placeholder suggesting that they add a sentence that highlights, number one, the gap in our knowledge. What did we not know before they did this study? And secondly, what did they do specifically in this study to fill that gap? So moving on, the authors have also provided a really nice summary of the results here, the key findings. I had very few comments to make on this. And they've also made an attempt at a concluding sentence here where they state that based on their findings, there's a need for further study on the mechanisms of transcription under these conditions. This is suitable. I don't think it's optimal. And so I put in a comment here as well. Oh, I apologize. That's for an earlier one. But this is a good segue to say that while, again, they have most of the elements that I expect in the abstract, there are two kind of red flags for me here as an editor in terms of presenting the significance and really highlighting the novelty of the study. One of that is that their concluding sentence, which is your opportunity to say, this is what is really important about my study. They've chosen to say our findings mean that we need more research. And so I've put in a comment here that is suggesting, can you please try focusing on what the paper contributes to the field instead of what somebody else needs to do next? The other red flag for me was when they began describing their results, they used the word confirm. So they say that their results confirm previous studies. And as an editor, this says to me that maybe the study is not so novel if the major finding is simply confirming something else that somebody else has done. So that's a suggestion I've made as well, is that they might want to go back here and kind of emphasize less the confirmatory results in their paper and instead highlight the novelty and the significance. Underneath the abstract here, you'll see here is an excerpt from the report that accompanied our edit. We provided a description of what would be helpful to include on the title page and abstract. And I've also provided a summary here of the key points that I think are most important to address to strengthen the abstract. And again, that's highlighting what the gap in the literature was and providing a statement of the study aim. Minimizing language that can undermine the perceived impact of the study findings. And then finally, using that final sentence in the abstract to highlight the significance and the novelty of the findings from the study. Deepesh, do we have any questions about the abstract, or shall we go ahead with the introduction? Okay. So moving on to the introduction, I've included the whole section here. We're not going to go through every paragraph and every sentence. It's a lot of content, but it's nice to see the entire section so you can get an idea of the overall flow and structure. So as we all know, the purpose of the introduction is to present the context of the study, to situate it within the field, and also to provide just enough information for the readers to understand the study itself. At a structural level, what I'm looking at as a language and content editor is that this information in the introduction, it needs to flow from the most general to the most specific. So I think of that as a funnel shape. You go from the broadest to the narrowest as you move through the section. The authors of this paper have done a fairly good job with that. They start off again talking about in the first paragraph, what is glucose? What is glucose starvation? How does this affect transcription? You'll see here that there are a number of passages that are highlighted in turquoise and are in green text as well. This indicates passages that I've moved from elsewhere in the section, because when I read through this, I did see that while all of the information that I needed to understand the study was in this section, the order didn't quite make sense to me. So I have kind of cut and pasted a few elements of this text to create a much clearer narrative story. I do want to highlight this short paragraph here that we're going to come back to and talk about in detail later. The authors here mentioned that previous studies had investigated gene expression patterns in fission yeast under glucose starvation conditions and didn't elaborate on this anymore. This is a really important point, and this is why I've pulled it out and made it its own separate paragraph here. And we'll come back and talk more about this later. Moving on, I want to highlight a few other major structural changes that I've made. So here we're looking at, this is the second to last paragraph in the introduction, and then moving on to the last. So by the second to last paragraph in the section, in the introduction, you should be very specific now, zeroing in on exactly what the gap in the literature is. And the authors have done a fantastic job here. The final sentence in the second to last paragraph of the introduction is where you state what the gap in the literature is. And here they very clearly said there is a need for new technologies to define transcription ends during glucose starvation. This is a great statement of the study gap, and I've put in a little comment here saying, please use this pattern and put that in the abstract as well. Importantly, this statement should be immediately followed. The first sentence in the last paragraph of the introduction should state the study aim. And in this case, they did include a statement of their study aim in the introduction, but it was a lot earlier. So as an editor and a non-expert on this subject reading through it, I kind of had trouble. I had to look for it and find out where it was. So what I did was I cut it out and I pasted it in the location where I expect to see it as an editor. And again, this is now a very nice statement of this is the study aim. In this circumstance, the authors have chosen to use the final paragraph to provide a summary of the key findings, which is optional. And in this case, I've left it in because I think they did a good job. And they also did a fantastic job of highlighting the significance of their study in the final sentence of the introduction, saying this is the first example of the use of these technologies to map the transcripts. This is a lovely statement of the novelty. And again, I've suggested to the authors, please include a sentence like this at the end of the abstract, because you know what's important about your research. We all want to know it too. So I do want to go back to that brief paragraph that we mentioned. As an editor, when I'm reading this manuscript for novelty and significance, this is a red flag that came up for me. This one sentence where they said, previous studies have investigated very similar topics. And you can see they cite 3 references here, but they don't talk about these papers at all. And this is concerning to me because not knowing the literature this deeply, the question I start asking myself is, did somebody already do this study? Is the current study simply a repetition of something that's done before? And so this is a major point that I've raised with the authors, is that I really want them to expand this sentence into a full paragraph that describes these 3 previous studies and specifically points out what are any shortcomings or limitations of the earlier 3 studies that the current study is addressing. So if we scroll down, I apologize, go ahead, Paige.
Yeah, so Emily, to your current suggestion over here, how can a researcher enhance the description of the current study's context and present the knowledge gap effectively in the introduction section, as you suggested previously in the last paragraph?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deepesh. Here it is really a balance. You need to find, and I'm sure you already know, being experts in your own field, what are the most closely related studies to what you're doing. Often it's your competitors or your collaborators. And while you don't need to go into a huge amount of detail in the introduction, you really should have at least 1 to 2 sentences describing each of the most closely related studies. Because again, that's going to say to the editors and to your readers, this is what we already know, and this is the next step that we're taking. So that's why I like to see at least 1 full paragraph that is dedicated to, say, the 3 to 5 most closely related studies, because that's going to show the very focused context of what your study is. So scrolling down here to the excerpt from the report. As before, you will see in the report that we send you, we've provided an opinion and a summary of the revisions that we've done. In the recommendation section, again, I like to focus exclusively on the things that are going to make a difference to whether or not your paper gets accepted or rejected. And so in this case, I've really highlighted only that main point, which is asking them to expand the paragraph referencing previous studies, because to me, this is going to make or break whether an editor decides to send the paper out to review. All right, so next we're going to cover the results in the discussion. We're going to do these 2 sections together, as that's how we present them in the report. For the results section, this is often fairly straightforward for most authors to write, because this is what you know. This is the work that you've been doing, and you're confident in what you've done and what you've shown. I've pulled out 1 subsection of the results because often any issues or concerns that I have that come up in the results section are kind of the same over and over throughout the section. So we can often provide comments on 1 subsection that are relevant throughout the entire one. So I do want to point out that these authors made a very strong start in this subsection by using a heading that is what we call declarative, which means that it states a key finding from the study. So instead of describing what was done, saying, oh, we looked at gene expression, here they said, we did differential gene expression analysis, and we showed changes in carbon metabolism, and we showed changes in ribosome biogenesis. This is fantastic because before a reader has even gotten into your data, they already know what you found because you've written it out in the heading. So this is a great technique to use to highlight the novelty of your findings. I did want to address the first paragraph here, where they made a strong start by providing some background information, talking about glucose starvation and transcription. Although the authors have gone from the background information directly into referencing a figure and showing what the results are. And what I'm missing here is a statement of what they did and why. So this is the element that bridges the gap between what did we know before and what do we know now, is you want to say, in order to find out X, we did Y. So I put a placeholder here that is connected with a comment that I'm not sure if you can see all of it on the side here, but that essentially says, please put in 1 or 2 sentences that states the purpose of this set of experiments and has a very brief overview of how you perform those experiments. And it's a minor change, but again, it helps tell that nice story that will make sense to a reader. The bulk of the subsection is a really nice presentation of the results. They've carefully cited all the figures and tables where you can see the data, which is the appropriate way to do this. The section, however, ended very abruptly with a description of a result. And so I've made another structural suggestion here where I've asked the authors to consider putting in a concluding sentence. And I've provided a template saying, taken together, these data show that. And the role of this concluding sentence is to essentially provide a summary of what is the most important conclusion that you drew from all of the results and the data that you've described in that section. And there's a trick to doing this that will make it a lot easier for you, is that basically this concluding sentence should be very, very similar to the heading of the subsection, because essentially you're saying the same thing. This is what we found. I've pulled out the figure as well to show you that there's yet another way to do this. So this is the associated figure, which you can see is really nicely formatted. It's easy to read, it's easy to interpret. They have carefully described everything in each panel of the figure. They've missed an opportunity here though, in that they did not provide a figure title. This is not permitted by all journals, but most journals will let you do a figure title. And this is another opportunity to simply say, this is the main conclusion that we drew from this set of data and experiments. So I have added some text here as a suggestion, and of course suggested that the authors revise it further if they prefer. But I've essentially rephrased the heading of the subsection to repeat that under glucose starvation conditions, we see changes in carbon metabolism and ribosome biogenesis. So the important point that I want to make here is that organizationally and structurally within one subsection of the results, you can highlight an important finding from your study in the subheading, in the concluding statement, and in the figure title. And this is a really nice way to help readers and editors very easily and quickly grasp the most important findings from your study. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the discussion, and I've included the whole section here. We're not going to talk about every element of it. It's a fairly long amount of text, but I'm going to highlight like a few points that I pull out again when I'm specifically thinking about significance as an editor. So the point of the discussion, a lot of people will use this as a place to sort of repeat or rehearse the results. And it's a missed opportunity. What you really want to be using this section for is to discuss your results in the context of the wider field. So this is an opportunity for you to show the advance that your study makes, the contribution that your study has made to the field, and how it adds to our knowledge of the topic that it's about. Structurally, these authors have started out in a great way by providing a little bit of background information and also restating the study aim. However, they've neglected the opportunity here to use this first paragraph of the discussion to provide a very brief summary of the key findings. And I know that when you're writing a paper, it can feel really repetitive to do this. But for readers who don't know your research as intimately as you do, it's really helpful to have a very concise summary, again, of all the findings that they've just read about in the results, because that will help structure it in their mind before they go on to read the kind of detailed analysis of it in the discussion. So that's why I've inserted a placeholder here and a comment suggesting to the authors that they expand this paragraph slightly to just provide, again, that list of the most important findings. And usually this is going to correlate with each subsection of the results gets one sentence in this paragraph. In the main body of the discussion, what we're looking for is ideally each paragraph should address one of the findings and analyze it critically and in depth by comparing it with results from previously published studies. There are a few structural elements that can really help here, so I'm going to try to point out a few examples of that. In the first paragraph here, they've done a really nice job of starting with what we call a topic sentence, which basically says this is what we're going to talk about in this paragraph. And what they've done is they've said that these are our results, and these results correspond well with previous reports. So right away, before I've even read this paragraph, I know that their findings are in concordance, in agreement with findings from the rest of the field. So I feel really good about this. So this is confirmatory, this is validated, this is what we expect. So that's a great topic sentence. They've also done a really good job here by concluding this paragraph with a sentence that highlights what their study adds. And they're saying that this finding from their study is very novel because no other previous study has considered, in this case, a time lag. So this is a structural element that I always recommend including in the discussion, and each paragraph in the main body of the discussion with a sentence that highlights either the novelty of that finding discussed in that paragraph or suggests future directions that are based on your findings. And you'll see moving through the discussion that there are a few points where they've missed those opportunities. So here I put in a placeholder and a suggestion saying, put in a concluding sentence here that again highlights the novelty or future directions. Following paragraph, they've done a great job of this again, saying this is the first study when we've done this. And this is an excellent way that you can highlight the importance of your study to your readers. So moving on to the end of this section, they go from the main body right to a concluding paragraph, which is acceptable. There is one thing you can do to a discussion, and a lot of journals will require this, and that's including a limitations paragraph, which was missing from this paper. This is an opportunity to kind of point out any weaknesses with your paper, anything that was perhaps outside of the scope of your study. And again, it's not necessary, but I think it's a really useful thing to do as a researcher for your colleagues to kind of point out a balanced and objective view of your study. So I've suggested that these authors include one. And I want to say that importantly, this is not a place to say, this is everything that's wrong with my study. It's a place to say, these are things that perhaps could have done better, and yet it is not a major negative about our paper, that our results are still reliable and our findings are still important to the field. And if there is a limitations paragraph in the manuscript that you provide us with, that's something that we can help with too, is helping you achieve that balance of kind of showing a limitation without emphasizing it too strongly. So in this
before we proceed to the next bit of it, I have a question which most of the researchers would definitely have, to understand what are the common misses which are missed out by the researchers while drafting the discussion section. Because you have talked about the to-dos which are to be considered, but however, what are the misses which are usually missed out by the researchers while drafting this section?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deepesh. Thank you. One thing that I see that is missed out on a lot is a lack of a comparison to the literature and a lack of like truly an in-depth comparison to existing studies. So it's pretty common for me to read papers where the authors essentially reiterate or repeat their results and in a lot of data. And as a reader, as an editor, I never want to see numerical data in a discussion. I never want to see p-values. I don't want to feel like I'm reading the results section again. What I want to know is, does this agree with previous findings? Does it not? If it doesn't, why do you think that's the case? Do you have suggestions about how we can resolve this controversy? Yeah, like I said before, like really an optimal discussion, what this is going to do is going to be thought-provoking for me as a scientist. It's going to say to, like, it's going to help me understand how your study fits into the field, how it interacts with data from other scientists, from other researchers, from other groups. And that's really a missed opportunity that I see often and like to encourage my authors to really take advantage of when they can.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing the editorial perspective and the reviewer's perspective over here, which would help the authors understand what are the common misses. We also have one more question from our audience. This is with respect to the results section. So the question is, please give me some suggestions for writing the results section of qualitative study?
A qualitative study, that's a great question. It's something that we see less commonly, and it can be challenging. That's a good question because you don't have that same kind of correlation between the data and the text that you would necessarily see in a quantitative paper. I would say at a structural level, you're still going to organize it in the same way, where each subsection of the results should be about one topic and one topic only. So for example, if it's a questionnaire-based study, each subsection would ideally correlate to one question from that questionnaire. You're still going to want to use those same structural elements that we talked about, highlighting the findings in the subheading, and also using the introductory and concluding sentences to guide readers through sort of the logic of the study design. An important point that authors sometimes miss is that at an organizational level, each subsection in the results should correlate to exactly one figure or table. And this is to help people find the data easily, and also to kind of make it a very organized presentation that people can find easily. And that may help you write that as well, is when you think about how you're presenting your data, what text do you want to correspond to what figure or table you're showing.
Thank you, Emily. This does address the question.
Great. So I'll very quickly just talk through this screenshot of the report. And again, as we've discussed previously, kind of my main goal with the report is to highlight the key points that might keep your paper from being considered for publication. So in the recommendation section, I've highlighted again, using these structural elements of introductory and concluding sentences throughout the results. Like I've just mentioned, making sure that each figure or table corresponds to a single subsection of the results. Using those figure titles, again, to really highlight the key findings. And then moving on to the discussion, including that summary paragraph at the beginning, using topic sentences and concluding sentences in the main body of the discussion. And finally, including this limitations paragraph, because for me, these are the most important elements for this section. So that's it for this discussion of the live edit of the paper. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can move back to the presentation.
So before we proceed to the presentation back, Emily, can you take up one more question from the audience?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is about the introduction section now.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, what is the better way to summarize the previous literature in introduction? Like how many sentences for each cited paper should be there?
That is a good question. For me, I would say that the answer depends on how closely related the study is. So basically, the more similar a previous study is to your current study, the more time you want to spend on it. So in the example that we gave, for example, they cited a lot of papers in the first paragraph about glucose starvation. That's really general knowledge, and it's okay to have half a sentence about glucose starvation with 7 citations after it. That's fine. But again, thinking about the funnel structure as we move towards the end of the introduction, and you're getting more specific and more narrow, you're going to want to spend more and more time talking about studies that are more and more closely related to your paper.
Thank you so much, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
We could proceed.
Great. Okay, so we did have a poll question that we wanted to ask, and this question is asking which of the following steps out of the 4 options we provided will help increase the chance of publication. And there could be more than one right answer, so feel free to select more than one. The options are making sure that the objectives of the study align with the journal scope, providing as much information as possible in the method section, checking for plagiarism, and finally, citing older studies as often as possible.
So we will wait for all the attendees to choose an appropriate option. You could choose more than one option over here. Request you all to take this poll, which would help us to understand your views about this particular aspect. I hope everyone has taken the poll. We would wait for 10 more seconds and then we would stop sharing this poll and we would share the results with you all.
Okay, so our responses are in. We have a lot of enthusiasm for the first answer, which is aligning the objectives to the journal scope and readership. Absolutely. If your paper is not in scope for a journal, it's not going to be sent out for submission. This is an important point. Choose the right target journal. Providing as much information in the method section as possible. It's important, obviously, in a paper to be reproducible. This is not likely to be something that will get your paper rejected before it goes out to review. But yes, something to think about down the line. We also have a lot of enthusiasm for plagiarism check. And yes, many journals will run a text plagiarism check before they even consider a paper. So it is, yeah, it's important. Make sure that your work is original. Make sure that your text is original.
I'll just add over here the first and the third option where we are focusing on aligning the manuscript with the readership and the journal's aim and scope, and also ensuring that the plagiarism, that is the plagiarized text in the file, is minimal. These are mostly like checkpoints at the initial screening at the journal's end. Say suppose if one of this does not meet the journal's criteria, there could be a desk rejection. A desk rejection is something where the manuscript would not be shared with the reviewers to review it, or it would not undergo a peer review process, and it would be sent back directly to the authors. So it is very important to address these 2 points in the manuscript prior to submission. That would help you get through the initial screening at the journal's end. So we'll proceed ahead. Yeah.
Right, so some of the parameters for assessment that we're looking at when we're editing your paper and generating the report, we are looking at the research strength, the strength of the study. And the elements that we look for there are kind of the summary of the study, again, looking at that abstract and judging the originality and the significance of the research. Next, we're performing a very thorough content review, and that includes a thorough assessment, a comprehensive assessment of each element of the paper up to and including the references section. We also do an assessment of the structure, style, and format of the paper, and that's looking at a lot of things we just talked about in the live edit, the clarity, the organization and structure, the style, ensuring that the authorship is appropriate. We look carefully at suitability for the journal instructions. So is the manuscript compatible with the topic, the scope of the journal, and also does it adhere to the structural requirements for a manuscript? And finally, our experts will provide a conclusive statement, and that's sort of just an overall opinion or perspective on what they think of your paper.
So Emily, I have a question here for the audience to understand. How can an author realistically assess the significance of or novelty of the study prior to submission?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and it's a very challenging thing to do, honestly, as a researcher, because you know your research so intimately well. You are very embedded in your own field, and it can be difficult to have an objective perspective or view of your own work. It's very helpful to talk to colleagues about it, to get feedback from your department, from people who work outside of your lab. When you try to explain your results, is it something that they can get easily, something that sounds interesting to them? Evaluating the significance of your own results, particularly if you're trying to target a very high impact factor journal, your findings need to be of interest to somebody who is not directly in your field. So the most significant findings are things that are going to be very interesting to colleagues in other departments and possibly even other scientific disciplines. For studies that you're perhaps targeting to a lower impact factor journal, we look at the size of advance. So if you look at other papers that have been published in that journal, kind of how big of a discovery was it that they made, and kind of compare that to the step that your study has made. Particularly clinical studies, we can look at cohort sizes as often a clue as well. If somebody's done a multi-center international clinical study, it's going to inherently have kind of a higher perceived impact than a single center study in one ethnicity, for example. So you do need to do a lot of kind of comparison to the literature and also consulting people who might have a more objective view of your work.
Thank you, Emily, for the insights.
Of course. Yeah, so along the same lines, when we're evaluating the research strength of your study, this list shows kind of the questions that we're asking ourselves. We're looking at the literature review and then introduction. How does this paper fit into the existing body of research? We're looking at novelty, and this is can take a few forms. Kind of the concept of the study, is it novel? Is the methodological approach novel? Are the findings novel? These are all elements that contribute. We're asking about the clarity and the specificity of the research question, which is why it's super important to state that clearly in the abstract and introduction of your paper. Robustness of research methodology is important. If it's a very interesting study that was done in an inappropriate way, it's not going to be novel. Results, how well does your study answer the question that you posed? This is a really important point. The comparative analysis is what we've just talked about, like looking at your key findings and comparing them to findings from other studies in your field and just looking at that comparison. How do they match up? Using the discussion and the conclusion to provide that in-depth analysis of your results. And finally, one element is the quality of the writing. This doesn't directly affect the significance of your findings, but it can affect the perception of the significance of your findings, which is why we'd like to help with the English language usage as well as the organization and structure. Here we have a screenshot of the relevant part of the report that deals with the originality and the significance of your research. This example is very specific to the paper that we just looked at. So kind of just a few important points that I want to pull out here. We've provided a summary of the revisions that we've made. Also, our editor has suggested, as you can see in the blue text here, a few papers that might be useful to cite that weren't provided in the original literature review. This is a great thing that we can add as a service, is maybe suggesting some papers that you might have overlooked. And finally, doing that plagiarism check as well to give you an opportunity to address that before you submit the paper.
Okay. Emily, like considering we have covered all the sections of the manuscript, the one major section which we are yet to cover is basically the method section. So the researchers would like to know, how can a researcher ensure that the method section addresses all the parameters, and if there are any guidelines or approvals required to be present in the method section?
Sure. So kind of the main thing that you want to focus on when you're writing your method section is that you want to provide just enough information to allow another researcher to replicate your study. So some of the elements that we look at as are listed on this slide, that first point is right there, clarity and detail. You want to make sure that there's enough information that includes where did you buy your materials from, so somebody can, repeat the experiment exactly. We look at the research design, that is making sure that the study design is appropriate for the question that you asked. Same thing for sampling and participants. If you've done a study in animals or humans, did you have the right sample size? Is it the appropriate, patient population for that question? Data collection, this is an important one, obviously, showing how you generated your data. Ethical consideration, it's crucial. And any study that involves animals or humans, you absolutely need to specify who you got ethical approval from and when, and consent if you had human participants. Looking at variables and measures, so that's how did you collect your data and assess the results. And finally, the statistical analysis, is the statistical approach that you used appropriate for the type of data that you generated?
So Emily, will take a few questions from the audience as we have a few on the Q&A screen. So first is it strict to follow the word count limit mentioned by the journal?
Ooh, yeah, this is a tricky one and is sometimes controversial. Yes and no. You want to be in the range. So if a journal says the abstract needs to be 200 words and yours is 215 words, it's fine. Don't stress out about it. If your abstract is 500 words, that's a problem. The editor is not going to want to read it and they will send it right back to you. So as a general rule, I would say kind of try to be around the numbers that they suggest, but don't worry if you're pretty close.
Yes. So one more thing which most of the journals these days have started, that in case they do put a disclaimer, in case your word count limit is higher than the one which is being mentioned, then please do provide the reason for the same in the cover letter. So this would help the editors understand why exactly the word count is exceeding the limit. Is the content or the like word count which is adding to it is significant, or it can be like avoided to meet the journal limit. So that is another thing which the authors can consider following.
Good point.
There's one more question, Emily, before we move ahead. What do you think the most important factor which influence the citation of the paper?
Oh, probably the most important factor affecting how often your paper is cited is going to be the novelty. So anything that makes a big splash, something that strikes people as being very new, very unexpected, is going to get a lot of attention. The second factor that I would say is going to be the robustness of your study. So if you have answered a question very, very thoroughly in a way that's very reliable and people can see from reading your paper like how valid your data is and feel very confident about it, that is going to garner a lot of citations over the years, because people are going to keep coming back to your paper as a touchstone, as something very reliable that becomes like kind of a very important part of the field.
Yes, thank you, Emily.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so here we have an example of some of the comments that we might make after we've taken a look at and revised your method section. And again, these are very specific to the paper that we just looked at, where we might ask, for example, that you specify the exclusion and inclusion criteria in a clinical study, specifying the data collections and statistical methods we've talked about. Anything that's unclear, for example, if you've mentioned a correlation, but we don't know how you identified that, we're going to ask for more detail. Whether the p-value was two-tailed, yeah, again, this is just looking at the appropriateness of the statistical analyses. And this final point here, looking at sample size, it's pretty common to calculate that before performing a study to ensure that it's powered to show what you want to show. And if that's not clear from the paper, we're going to ask that you add that information. We also do this review of manuscript compatibility for the target journal. If you've specified a journal that you're interested in submitting to. First point is it does it align with the journal's scope? So is it something that the journal will want to publish? And you can get an idea of this by looking at past issues and seeing if they've published papers similar to yours. Checking the author guidelines and considering the journal's readership. These are just other ways to see, like, is this something that the journal will be interested in? Is this something that they think their readers will be interested in? You can also consider, and we will also consider on your behalf, looking at journals that published similar studies previously, and we can sometimes give you some alternatives if we don't think that your target journal is necessarily the best fit, is looking at other journals that might be a better candidate for you. And here is just an example of that section of the report that we would send back to you. And in this case, we've agreed with them that the manuscript is within the scope of the target journal, that the target journal has previously published similar articles, and that, yes, we agree that this is a good fit.
So Emily, before we proceed to the next segment, I would like to ask, how important is it to submit the manuscript to a suitable journal, and how can the author identify appropriate journals?
So the biggest advantage of submitting to the right journal, or a right journal, is that it's going to save you time. So if you submit to a journal that's not quite the right scope, or is maybe a higher impact factor than is appropriate, it's going to cost you time, because journal offices are slow and they will spend several weeks evaluating your manuscript and taking their time getting back to you. And that's very frustrating to have to wait a month, 2 months and get a no from the journal. So that's the main importance, I think, of choosing the correct target journal. In terms of finding what are suitable candidates, first of all, I would say focus on a group candidates or target journals, not just one. There's no perfect home for your paper out there. I usually recommend that you come up with a list of 4 to 5 that are a range of impact factors, so that you have an idea of where alternatives are if it doesn't work out at your first choice. And yeah, as we talked about previously, it's important to do your best to objectively analyze the level of advance that your study represents.
So before we move ahead, let's take a poll to understand the challenges faced by our audience majorly. So the question is on your screen. Basically, what are the major challenges you have encountered when aiming to publish in high impact factor journals? So you could select more than one options over here, basis your challenges being faced. The first option over here is balancing the need for technical depth with readability, identifying and filling gaps in literature, incorporating necessary ethical considerations, and the last one is demonstrating the novelty and significance of your research. I would request everyone to take this poll to share your challenges so that we could understand what are the major challenges faced by most of the researchers these days. And we would be able to assist you with some best practices, some tips, which Emily would share with us so that it makes things easier for us going forward. We would keep the poll for 10 more seconds, and then we would show the results on the screen. So yeah, we have our results. There are 2 which have an approximately equal rating, and the last one, basically, that is demonstrating the novelty and significance, is mainly like a major challenge by most of the researchers. And the other 2 are balancing the need for technical depth with readability and identifying and filling gaps in literature. So Emily, what's your opinion with respect to the first, second, and the 4th option here?
Sure. So let's start with the 4th option, since this seems to be, a major concern. Demonstrating the novelty and significance of your research is challenging for a lot of researchers, and it's challenging because a lot of it has to do with the writing and the presentation in your paper, and this is a skill that a lot of us do not learn in graduate school or as a postdoc. You kind of learn it as you go. Honestly, overall, my main suggestion is kind of what we talked about during the live edit, is using these structural elements of the paper to highlight this repeatedly and make it very clear for your readers. So that's using, excuse me. So that's using the subheadings and concluding sentences throughout the results and discussion to very clearly highlight your most novel findings. It's using that concluding sentence in the abstract to very clearly point out, is this the first study to have shown this? Is this the first study to have done this? Cover letter is also actually an opportunity to do this as well. You have a little more leeway in a cover letter to be more personal and more emotional about your results. So you can talk about how excited you are or how unexpected the results were and what a big impact it will make to the field. So that's an approach as well. Looking at responses number 1 and 2, balancing technical depth and readability can be challenging, specifically if you're, for instance, in the bioinformatics field. That can be a very challenging one to come across in terms of readability. And in this case, I would say that really the text of the results is where you want that technical depth to come out. In terms of readability, you're going to have a chance to talk about your results in more general terms in the discussion and to present them visually in the figures and tables, and that's going to really help you achieve that balance. Identifying and filling gaps in literature, we'll address just really quickly. I know we need to move on. That really comes down to the study design part of it, and that's going to be based a lot in your literature review and how you identify the question that you're going to address.
Yes, thank you so much, Emily. So now that we all have seen what all it takes to modify a manuscript which is being drafted to make it of publishable standard with multiple intervention in it, let's try and understand what does Inago provide you, what appropriate service of Inago would be helpful for the researchers in this case. So Inago provides top impact scientific editing service, which offers in-depth scientific and developmental editing by 3 native English speaker editors. So you have the best chances of publication by a high impact factor journal. So this is the major highlight of this particular service over here. Let's try and understand, apart from the enhanced version of the manuscript, what else the service provides. So the service would provide a mock peer review report, which includes the below aspects highlighted on the screen. The report would highlight the strengths and weaknesses of the manuscript, rates different aspects of your manuscript, along with suggestions on how it can be further enhanced, summary assessment of the originality and significance, and journal compatibility check. This is an invaluable report which helps us understand where your manuscript would stand in comparison to the available literature, plus current research trends and suggestions on enhancing the overall research presentation. Along with this, you also receive a plagiarism report, which highlights the plagiarized text in the manuscript. So the expert who works on your file would paraphrase the plagiarized text to overall reduce the similarity index. Along with it, would provide some actionable next steps for you as suggestions to be considered prior to submission. Additionally, coming to the auxiliary support, which is provided through the service, that is customized cover letter, highlighting the significance. It also provides revision support during the manuscript peer review at the journal's end, which is up to 365 days. Coming to the last bit of this particular report. So lastly, towards the end of this report, the expert would provide conclusive statements on an overall status of the manuscript or the study in the report. For example, the case which we discussed along with Emily today, here the author had performed literature review basis literature, the research topic. However, considering the esteemed impact factor of the journal, which indicates there would be a stringent peer review process attached to it, it was assessed by the research the expert that the authors should clearly highlight the prime novelty of the study by including more relevant literature. So that is something which is very helpful as a conclusive statement for the authors to understand how they can proceed. Coming to the second leg of the session, that is the live Q&A, I would request all the attendees who have not posted their queries yet to please send your queries using the questions tab and via the chat box. Please feel to drop your questions and share your struggles and experiences. So meanwhile, we'll take a few questions which we have already received. So Emily, there is one question which states, future research direction is not encouraged to include in the paper in my thought because of two reasons. Okay, they have given their reasons also. The competitive researcher will work quickly for competing our group. We will lose patent submission right if we describe an application possibility clearly in our area. So what is your opinion in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. In this case, specifically, if there's a patent question involved, if you do choose to include future research directions in your paper, keep it very general. So instead of saying, this is the experiment that we're going to do, or this is the piece of equipment we're going to design, you can keep it very vague. Something like, in the future, it would be helpful to develop this further because it will be helpful for patients, or in the future, it would be useful to explore this further with more cutting edge techniques, if that makes any sense. If you're very concerned about this, of course, go ahead and leave it out. We don't at all want to put you in a situation where you're going to get scooped or have competition from colleagues.
Thank you, Emily, for the insights. It actually helps the researcher understand it well. The next question over here is, should we describe the results of secondary testing analysis of which we got from a primary testing in the results section, not in the discussion section?
Okay, if I understand the question, it's saying we've got primary results and we've also got secondary results, which are not as important, and where do we present those? So the rule is all new data has to be in the results section. We don't want anything new as a surprise in the discussion. If it's not very key to understanding your study, if it's not the most important finding, a really good option is to put it in the supplementary information if your target journal allows that, because then you've included the data, you've shown the data, but you haven't taken up valuable space in the results section. And that way it won't kind of distract the readers from your more important primary conclusions.
Yes, right. There's one question which is with respect to the acceptance percentage. So one of the audience members would like to know what is the like chances of getting published in a Q1 ranking journal.
So the exact numbers, I don't know. Obviously, we've all had the experience that basically the higher the impact factor, the lower the acceptance rate is kind of the rule. So if what you're looking for is quick publication, definitely aim a little lower. If what you're looking for is that kind of big publication in a big journal, then go ahead and aim for your target, and kind of just keep in mind that they do have much more stringent criteria. The very high impact factor journals do a lot of what Deepesh referred to as a desk rejection. So they filter out a lot of things on submission that don't even get sent out for review. So at the very least, you know, if your paper isn't suitable for that level, you will know quickly instead of having to wait months for peer review.
Right. We have another question. This is with respect to the paraphrasing, which would be required to reduce the overall similarity index or the plagiarized text. The question is how to paraphrase the important sentences since key findings may appear many times.
Well, if you're talking about key findings within your own paper, then it's okay to use the same phrasing over and over. What you don't want to do is to copy text exactly from somebody else's paper, and importantly, from a paper that you have published previously. If it has been published, then it's considered plagiarism, even if you wrote it the first time. kind of a rule of thumb that we use to estimate that is if you have more than 5 or 6 words in a row, like a phrase that's about 6 words long, if it's more than that and it's exactly the same, that's usually considered plagiarism. So try using synonyms, try changing the order of phrases is a way to do it. Sending it to somebody for copy editing is helpful too, because a native speaker will kind of have a little more flexibility with the vocabulary that they can bring to it.
Right, right. So there's one interesting question by one of the attendees. What are the points to write in a cover letter? What should be the difference between abstract content and the cover letter content?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah. So the cover letter is almost essentially the abstract, but written in a less formal manner. So you do want to include all of the key elements that you have in the abstract. So the background, the point of the experiment, very brief description of methods, results and findings. All of those you want in your cover letter, 1 or 2 paragraphs. But you also have the flexibility in the cover letter, like I said earlier, to be more personal about it, to kind of explain why you find the results exciting, why you believe that they're suitable for the journal. And yeah, that's the main difference between the cover letter and the abstract, is that the abstract is for readers, the cover letter is just for the editor. So you're using that letter to say, this is why you want my paper, this is why you want my paper published in your journal. So you talk a lot about suitability and scope for the journal and their readers in the cover letter.
Right. So there are 2 similar questions basically over here. We'll club both of them. So one is for highly impact factor journals such as Nature, what is the most important consideration by the editor? Okay. Is the affiliation really affecting the decision? Okay. And the next follow-up question to it is, why are we asked about our origins when submitting to like an article to a reputable journal?
Ooh. I will handle the second question first. Nobody should be asking you about your country of origin or your native language. It's inappropriate, it's unprofessional, that should not be happening. So if you're getting that question from a journal, I have concerns about whether they're a reputable journal. That should not be a factor. In terms of what a high impact factor journal is looking at, what's kind of the most important. So Nature, for example, I used to work with Nature Publishing Group, and there's 3 rules for what an editor looks at when a paper comes across their desk. So what they're looking at is the novelty of the study, the robustness of the methods, and general interest. So that's how new and interesting are your findings, how reliable is your work, and also who's going to care about this? Is it just people in your field? Is it people in related fields? Is it, I don't know, physicists or chemists also, other scientists as well? And kind of the more general the interest is, the more likely a journal like Nature is to consider it.
Yes, I'll just add one more thing to it. There would be a few submission systems which would be asking for the author's origin or the complete affiliation address. Okay, here the purpose majorly is to understand your origin, so that there are some journals which provide some discounts or waive of some fees with respect to publication, basis the origin, basis whether it's a developing country or a developed country, and all of those criteria which they have. So that could be one of the reasons. However, that is through the submission system and not after the paper has been accepted or during the peer review process. Okay, we'll take one last question before we proceed to the next segment. So one question is, some journals require materials and methods section before results section. Are there any particular considerations that should be taken into account in this case?
Yep, so that's a structural preference that some journals have. Honestly, a lot of readers are not going to read your methods section anyways, so it's not a section that you need to spend too much time worrying about. Kind of the one thing that comes to mind is if that is the order in which the text is presented. One thing that I notice a lot is where you define your abbreviations. So if a lot of terms are abbreviated and used for the first time in the methods, you might want to define them again in the results if the results come after, because again, a lot of readers are just going to skip right over the methods to the results. And if they haven't read those abbreviations, they're not going to know what you're talking about.
Yes, right. Emily, I would request you to take one more question, which is really going to be helpful for the entire audience. So one question is, what is the key to find a good literature? With less experience in the research field, how I would like to know it?
So it sounds like we're talking about how to perform a good literature review, essentially.
Yes.
So use the right search engine. Google Scholar is one that a lot of people use. Personally, I prefer PubMed. I think that's really the gold standard in the research field. You're going to want to choose the right keywords, make sure that they're specific. So choose keywords that are highly relevant to your study and very specific to your field. You can use combinations of keywords in a search string, and that's going to pull up literature that's very relevant to you. Another trick that is quite useful is if you have one or two papers that you know of that are very closely related, look through their reference section and pick out, the papers that look particularly relevant and interesting from there. And you can do that, as a chain. You look up the references from that, you read those papers, look at their reference sections, and follow that as well. And that will give you a clue as to what other people in your field consider reliable and interesting research.
Yes, the second option which you suggested is something which most of the early researchers do follow it, because it's an easy way to find out relevant literature. Yes. So we have tried to cover all the questions during this live Q&A round. However, if there are any questions which are unaddressed, we would do get back to you and do resolve those questions. Okay. Here are some special discounts on Inago editing services for all the participants. Based on the region, you could scan the code. So please check out the website to know more. Thank you, Emily, for your valuable time and suggestions. We are all enlightened and have useful takeaways from this session. We request all the participants to please take the feedback survey by scanning the QR code displayed on the screen and let us know if the discussion was helpful and what would you expect in the future sessions from us. Thank you for joining the webinar. See you all next time.